Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forum webinar series. My name is Sprague, Vice President for Government Relations for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'll be moderating today's panel, which is titled Advocacy during the first 100 days of the Biden administration and the 117th Congress. As a reminder, Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This webinar series is made possible by members of Preservation Leadership Forum, and we sincerely thank those of you who are with us today. Next slide, please. We have a great panel with us today to talk about the changes in Washington and historic preservation advocacy in the 117th Congress. But before we begin, I have a few technical items to relay. First, we will attempt to take questions from the audience during the webinar. You can submit these questions via the Q&A function, and you are welcome to submit these questions at any point during the webinar, but we will wait until after our panelists have presented to pose questions. And how many we're able to get to will really depend on our timing constraints. You are also welcome to communicate to all participants through the chat function, which we encourage you to do. And secondly, following the program, we will send out a recording of today's webinar directly to the email that you use to register. And finally, all forum webinars are archived in our forum webinar library. So come back and visit those as well. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and the topic areas for the webinar. As this slide lays out, well, first, we're very grateful to have our first two speakers with us today. John Bosworth, Senior Legislative Assistant in the Office of Representative Earl Blumenauer, and Maggie Ward, Legislative Assistant in Representative Mike Turner's office. Representatives Blumenauer and Turner together chair the Historic Preservation Caucus in the House of Representatives. The Historic Preservation Caucus is a bipartisan group of roughly 100 members that support key historic preservation programs and legislation that helps preserve historic places. With the support of the Historic Preservation Caucus, we are enjoying our fourth successive year of record funding for the Historic Preservation Fund, and we certainly would not be where we are today with the historic tax credit in place as a permanent part of our tax code without the leadership of Congressman Blumenauer and Congressman Turner, both of whom so clearly appreciate and understand the value that historic preservation brings to our nation and to our communities. So welcome, John and Maggie. Thank you for being here. And you needn't look too far to find historic preservation experts than those that you're privileged to work with on a regular basis. I'm grateful to welcome my colleague Sharee Williamson, Senior Associate General Counsel with the National Trust, who will describe several key preservation priorities for the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Merrill Hoopengardner to the conversation today. Merrill is the president of the National Trust Community Investment Corporation, a for-profit subsidiary of the National Trust that facilitates tax credit equity investments in support of sustainable, heritage-rich communities nationwide. Merrill is also the chair of the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, and we're certainly grateful for her strong leadership and advocacy in support of the historic tax credit. So if we could just back up one slide to organize the conversation, we've outlined several topic areas where historic preservation advocacy will be important as the Biden administration works to implement its agenda and as Congress tackles key issues. On the legislative side, we look forward to hearing about opportunities to make improvements. Looks like we're still a few slides ahead. If we can just back that up. Thank you. key issues as the Biden administration works to implement its agenda and as Congress tackles key issues. And on the legislative side, we look forward to hearing about opportunities to make improvements to the historic tax credit, some of the challenges historic rehabilitation projects are facing, and some of the potential legislative vehicles where we might advance this legislation. We also look forward to hearing from John and Maggie about the current budget and appropriations environment on the Hill and thoughts about reaching our goal of full funding for the Historic Preservation Fund this year. We would also welcome our panelists' input on climate change, a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration, and how historic preservation might best support those objectives. And then finally, on the regulatory side, President Biden has taken several steps on his first days in office, which we look forward to hearing more about from Sharee. And so within that broad framework, let's first turn it over to John for his thoughts on where things stand at the outset of the 117th Congress and how historic preservation and our community should be positioning itself to have our message heard.
Thanks, Shaw. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all and really have appreciated my time working with the National Trust and the broader historic preservation community in my time with Congressman Blumenauer. As Shaw mentioned, I'm a senior legislative assistant for Mr. Blumenauer, who represents Portland, Oregon, handle his tax, transportation, housing, and historic preservation issues, putting me in the center of a lot of the items that we'll talk about today. I think it's helpful to level set a little bit that the Congressman is one of the co-chairs of the Historic Preservation Caucus, as Shaw mentioned. Our other co-chair, Congressman Mike Turner, you'll hear from his staffer Maggie in a minute, but that's an opportunity for us on a bipartisan basis to engage with our nearly 100 members of the caucus and educate them about the historic preservation programs at the federal level, the recent activities and developments in the space, and also continue to get a good list of supporters for legislative efforts that we have throughout the year. I think our first and kind of annual focus that we have as a caucus is really on the Historic Preservation Fund. We have seen a marked increase in funding for the Historic Preservation Fund and the various programs that go into that fund since 2015, nearly a tripling of the overall funding amounts. And I think that's largely due in part to the work that a lot of the preservation community does in telling the stories of where this funding goes and making the local community impacts, illustrating that this funding is really impactful for communities large and small. Fiscal year 2020 and 2021, encompassing the last Congress, were both record years for historic preservation funding. We got nearly up to the fully authorized amount of $150 million with $144 million last year. I think we have a real opportunity to build on that, get to the fully authorized amount. But key to that is the preservation community continuing to show up, connect with their members of Congress, and tell the stories, as I mentioned, of what this funding goes toward and how it benefits those communities. It was also a really good year for preservation through our work in the historic tax credit. Congressman Blumenauer is a senior member of the House Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over tax and revenue issues and has led the charge on the committee to expand the historic tax credit. We faced some real challenges in the spring with COVID and are continuing to face them today, but we're successful in working with the National Trust and the HDC Coalition in order to get an extension to the substantial rehab timeline, which is really key for allowing for those projects to continue and not lose their ability to get to completion. But also we're able to work with our congressional leadership in the House to include not only our legislation, the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, but also a temporary bump up in the value of the credit in HR 2, which was the House infrastructure bill that passed over the summer. I I think we're really proud of the work that we did there. We recognize that legislation clearly has the votes to pass the House, and we'll look to build on that going forward and see if we can, in a potentially friendlier administration and environment in the Senate, if we can take that and actually get it enacted into law this year. Again, just like the Historic Preservation Fund, I think the key to this in the interim, while we wait for the next COVID relief package to come and then turn toward infrastructure, I think the key for each of us is really to engage with our local members of Congress, making the case and telling the story of what the historic tax credit has done for particular projects or particular areas or sections in communities, and tying that work federally and showing that there's legislation you can support to do more of these types of work, and making the case there. So I think that we've really shown in the last Congress that there's a great deal of momentum and support behind preservation, and hopeful that this year will be an opportunity to get to that fully authorized amount and also finally get this historic tax credit legislation across the finish line. And key to that, I think, is our bipartisanship in our working with our co-chair, Congressman Mike Turner from Ohio, who's been a key supporter and key member of the Historic Preservation Caucus. So with that, I'll turn it over to his staffer, Maggie, who can speak a little bit about what the congressman's up to and how we'll work together to get this across the finish line.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks, John, for turning it over to me. So just a brief introduction, as Shaw mentioned, I am the legislative assistant in Congressman Mike Turner's office. I handle a litany of issues, including energy, commerce, the environment, transportation and infrastructure, natural resources, and historic preservation. So not only do I focus on historic preservation, but also a lot of issues that are kind of tangential to historic preservation and what it means, and how it kind of fits into this policy equation that is Congress. So I thought John did a great job covering what has happened in recent years in terms of historic preservation. The Historic Preservation Fund has grown in recent years, and again, last year was a record year for its funding. So kind of moving forward with that momentum into this Congress, even facing the obstacles of COVID and COVID relief, will be really important. I think another important win for historic preservation last Congress was the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. Some provisions in the Great American Outdoors Act allowed national parks and national heritage areas to address some major backlogs they have. So Congressman Turner represents the Dayton, Ohio area, which is, although many people from North Carolina may dispute this, is the birthplace of aviation. So the Wright brothers were born and raised in the Dayton, Ohio area and invented their flying machine in West Dayton, which is still in Congressman Turner's district. So a lot of our national aviation heritage area sites were able to receive the funding that they need to address maintenance backlogs through the Great American Outdoors Act. And this was not only a phenomenon that happened in Dayton, a lot of national heritage areas and parks were also able to move past those backlogs and hopefully into new projects and a better future for the next year. So kind of looking to what historic preservation in Congress looks like in the 2021 year. Again, COVID will be a big one. Looking at COVID relief packages and how those can aid in historic preservation sites facing obstacles during the COVID pandemic will be really important, as well as any type of infrastructure proposals coming from the Biden administration. Those will definitely be important in molding the way we kind of legislate about historic preservation in the coming year. And then another important point for historic preservation is a lot of national heritage areas are facing sunsets and expiration dates in the next 2 to 3 years. So kind of looking at what heritage areas are coming up on their expiration dates and what types of things can be done to reauthorize and ensure long-term reauthorization for these heritage areas will definitely be something on the radar in this Congress. So I appreciate all of you taking the time to come today and listen, and I believe Sharee has some remarks for everyone as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie, for that handoff. So my name is Sharee Williamson, and I am a senior associate general counsel at the National Trust, and I'm responsible for litigation, legal advocacy, and also policy issues. And so I'm going to talk about some policy issues that we expect to see both in the first 100 days and also just over the term of the new Congress and with the shift in the administration. Next slide. I thought I would get started by talking about something for us to celebrate. I know many folks have been following the proposal to revise the National Register of Historic Places regulations, and we are also pleased that those regulations were not finalized prior to the presidential transition. And in fact, we understand that the rule making is now dead. This is something that the National Trust and many others have worked hard to address since the regulations were first proposed in 2019. Just to sort of recap, the proposal would have made nominating federal properties to the National Register more difficult, would have potentially interfered with use of the federal historic tax credit in some instances, would have interfered with Section 106 compliance, and it also would have altered the owner objection process for designating new historic districts in a way that would favor large landowners. It also was proposed without adequate tribal consultation. So overall, a rule with many issues. Last fall, we learned that the rulemaking was moving forward, and it was actually submitted to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, which is within the Office of Management and Budget. And so it was sent to OIRA for a 90-day interagency review process. And during that time, the National Trust and many others encouraged the preservation community to set up meetings with OIRA and share their concerns about the rule. And apparently OIRA was just inundated with requests from preservation organizations, state historic preservation offices, tribes, and tribal organizations expressing a range of serious concerns about the rule. And as a result, ultimately, this rule didn't make it over the finish line. It didn't get posted in the Federal Register. And when President Biden assumed office on January 20th, he issued a memo, which is a pretty standard first day memo, to the heads of all agencies that institutes a regulatory freeze on all new actions pending review by the new administration. So that officially put the brakes on this rulemaking. And that's something to celebrate. I mean, this is really a major preservation win that demonstrates the strength of the historic preservation movement when we work together on policy issues. Really want to express thanks to everyone that helped to turn the tide on this. One other issue related to the National Historic Preservation Act that I wanted to touch on is a secretarial order. It's Order 3389 on offsite compensatory mitigation. This was an order that was issued just before Christmas. It was issued by Secretary Bernhardt, and it places some severe, or former Secretary Bernhardt, and it places some really severe restrictions on consultation obligations through Section 106. Among other things, the order restricts the use of offsite compensatory mitigation, which would prevent most forms of mitigation except for document and destroy. So think photos, a report, maybe an on-site plaque would be the only mitigation measures available, even if a project was to destroy a historic site when it moved forward. The order also requires NEPA to be used as a substitute for Section 106 consultation and sets some really arbitrary and rigid compliance deadlines that are just 1 year for projects that warrant preparation of a full EIS, and only 180 days for all other projects. And the order also had some really negative implications for meaningful tribal consultation. So overall, just a really troubling sort of last minute order coming through the Secretary of Interior's office in December. The National Trust has really highlighted this order as a priority for revocation by the incoming administration. And we remain hopeful that that will happen and will happen quickly, and that this won't have any lasting negative impacts on cultural resources in processes being managed by the Secretary of the Interior, but stay tuned on that. So next slide. Another sort of good news item, not sort of, another big good news item is an initial order on the Antiquities Act review. As one of President Biden's first acts in office, he issued an order on January 20th, directing the Secretary of the Interior to review the revocation of the Bears Ears National Monument, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts National Monument. The order requires the Secretary to complete the review and submit a report to the President within 60 days with recommendations on actions that would be consistent with the Antiquities Act. One thing to remember is that there is still litigation challenging the revocation of the Bears Ears National Monument, which is still pending. The legal question in that case is whether a president has the legal authority under the Antiquities Act to revoke monument designations. Article 4 of the US Constitution gives Congress the sole authority over real property held by the United States. Congress can delegate that authority, and they've done so in many different statutes, including the Antiquities Act. But the plain text of the law of the Antiquities Act provides that presidents can designate national monuments, but doesn't mention revoking national monuments. And so the legal question is whether the president has only the authority to designate and not to revoke national monuments. This is the first time that this is an issue a question that's been raised in the courts, and it is pending before the DC District Court system, and it's not been ruled on. It's quite possible, given this executive order from President Biden, that the litigation will be stayed while the Secretary of the Interior completes this review process that's been ordered. And ultimately, it's widely anticipated that legal protections for these monuments will be restored. And it's really something to keep an eye on and watch for during the first 100 days. Next slide. President Biden has also come out with really a range of racial justice initiatives right off the gate. These initiatives are really touching all areas of government, but in the preservation world, one important one to watch is what happens with the NEPA rulemaking that was finalized last summer. So last summer, all the regulations under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, were replaced. And the rule changes were sweeping and quite troubling. Among other things, the rule changes would place limits on the types of projects that are subject to NEPA review at all. It also restricts the scope of review. For example, federal agencies under the new rules are not able to consider the indirect and cumulative impacts of proposed projects, including how projects may contribute to the causes of climate change. Other changes in the rules give more control to project applicants, private applicants during the review process. And there are also quite a few changes that make effective public participation more difficult. NEPA serves really an important role in ensuring that the federal agencies are able to consider environmental justice issues and have an opportunity to hear from the public that's impacted. Given the history of infrastructure siting in the country, and the burden that minority communities have often felt from these projects, these public participation changes are particularly concerning. And as a result, these regulations are expected to be really a major target for the Biden administration to review, ultimately probably revoke and replace. Another issue that we wanted to highlight is a tribal consultation executive memorandum that was issued actually just earlier this week. President Biden issued the order to improve tribal consultation and really just reaffirmed the importance and commitment between the federal government and tribal governments to ensure meaningful government-to-government engagement. The memo orders agency heads to identify ways to improve consultation within 90 days and to report to OMB with suggestions. And the order also tasks OMB with the responsibility to review these plans and report on their implementation over time. This is really just a great example of what is a major sort of broad policy change that's been dictated from the top of the executive branch, directing all federal agencies to prioritize federal-tribal relationships and to be more responsive to tribal needs and concerns. Next slide. So on federal climate policy, I want to sort of mention NEPA just again and remind you that the new rules remove the requirement that federal agencies consider cumulative impacts of their decisions. This change in the regulatory language is really widely understood to be targeting climate change reviews that have been ordered by courts in recent years, requiring federal agencies to consider the effects of their decisions on climate change under NEPA. This has come up in the context of oil and gas leasing, among other things like concerns about car fuel economy standards. So again, keep your eye on NEPA as a priority for restoration under the Biden administration. Another thing I wanted to mention is the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. It was actually, this is a sort of a, this is one of the major rules to address carbon emissions, and it's promulgated under the Clean Air Act. And it actually was struck down by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals the day before the presidential inauguration. The Affordable Clean Energy Rule, or the ACE rule, was actually put forward by the Trump administration to replace the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. The ACE rule weakened the regulations in the Clean Power Plan and that govern carbon emissions in the power generating sector. The National Trust filed an amicus brief in this case with the goal of drawing attention to the impacts of climate change on historic resources. The brief focused particularly on impacts to historic coastal communities that are impacted by sea level rise. This Court of Appeals decision that, as I mentioned, came down just the day before the transition really sets the stage for the Biden administration to scrap the ACE rule in its entirety and reinstate stronger carbon emissions regulations under the Clean Air Act. So that is another area to keep an eye on. I also wanted to mention a major executive order that was issued on climate issues just yesterday. One of the highlights of that order is that it includes an oil and gas leasing moratorium on public lands. It also orders DOI to review existing leases on public lands and to consider whether royalties that are being paid by companies to operate on public lands need to be adjusted to account for the climate costs caused by their activities. This was a major priority for many organizations to put this moratorium in place. And I think we can all expect that there's likely to be some litigation driven by the industry groups as a result of this moratorium. And the details of what that will look like will emerge in the coming weeks and months as the moratorium is enacted and decisions are made on implementing it. Another thing that was included in this executive order was the reestablishment of the Environmental Justice Interagency Council within the White House. This is another example of just a shift in priorities to the new administration to really focus on racial justice and climate justice together and to set that council back up within the White House. Another issue included in the executive order was the establishment of a new climate task force. The new task force includes the new head of the Council on Environmental Quality, as well as the heads of 21 other agencies. It orders agencies to prioritize climate concerns in all areas of decision-making. Again, this is another example of a broad policy mandate that is coming down from the new administration and that is setting the responsibility for addressing climate concerns really at the highest levels of the agencies. Before I hand things off to my colleague Merrill, I thought I would end by noting that this broad approach that's indicated in this new climate executive order is really likely to touch all areas of federal policy. I expect we will see changes to how new government funded housing projects are selected, just as one example, and more focus on reducing the climate impacts of development, just writ large. This is likely to present some opportunities for the historic preservation community and for reuse of existing building stock. It also may focus more development funds and federal funding and support onto development in existing city cores and away from supporting sprawl. So exactly what all of these policy shifts and changes mean, it's going to unfold over the next 100 days and during the next Congress and during the Biden administration. But a lot of change in focus is already occurring just since the inauguration on the 20th. And with that, I will kick things over to Merrill.
Great, thank you, Sharee. Now that we've had a broad look at preservation policy and how it could be impacted in the new administration, I wanted to bring us back a little bit and tease out some of what John introduced earlier in our conversation. I come to you today wearing two hats. As Shaw mentioned, I'm the president of NTCIC, the tax credit investment arm of the National Trust. We've invested over our 20-year period about $1.3 billion in historic tax credit projects nationwide, and have also included over $500 million in new markets tax credit financing, which ensures that the historic rehab we're financing is also benefiting low-income communities. So we're involved in advocacy both on the historic preservation side and on the new market side to ensure equity in the way that the credits are made available in the country. I also represent today the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. We're a group of industry participants, everything from lawyers and accountants and preservation consultants to investors and syndicators and developers who again work with the credit nationwide. And it's really been a pleasure to work with John and his colleagues in the House, particularly the Ways and Means Committee, as he mentioned, has been shouldering a lot of the work that we've done together with their colleagues on the Senate side and the Senate Finance Committee, as we've been trying to move forward post-tax reform to see where we can improve and enhance the historic tax credit. But first, I'll start on the next slide with where we are today. As everyone knows, we are still in many communities in the throes of economic challenges related to COVID. We've seen this across the historic tax credit industry. In March, we started seeing it immediately with existing operating properties that we had, where hospitality facilities, schools, other educational facilities, office buildings were immediately closed. And so operating projects were already having challenges. And that in turn has actually created problems for people who want to start historic rehab projects, because now it's informing the underwriting criteria of any financing partners that you've had. And so banks and other investors have had to revisit whether they want to invest in those kind of asset classes. So a lot of projects have had to retool what their plans are. It's also been exacerbated by the fact that there are both labor shortages and increased costs for labor, especially to ensure that you can have people on site in a way that's safe for your construction workers. And then we're seeing a lot of issues with supplies. Both the material cost has gone up, not unique to historic preservation, but steel cost is going up across the country. And then specific to preservation, we see issues with the specialty materials that are required. You know, you may be bringing in marble that you can only get from Italy now, or you need a specific craftsman to come and do work on a piece of your building, and that person's no longer able to travel or can't get the materials that they want. So we really are seeing widespread challenges that are increasing the cost of projects and extending the time. And the combination of those mean that projects are really struggling to get financing because you're getting an imbalance between supply and demand of capital. So what have we been doing about that? If you look at the next slide, we first approached in the middle of the summer, what could we do to have immediate impact? As John mentioned, as part of our legislative strategy and also our regulatory strategy, we immediately were reaching out to the IRS to ensure that projects that were already underway were still going to be able to receive credits if there were delays. As many of you know, there's a cliff test. Essentially, you have to complete your rehab and spend enough money on what you're doing to pass the so-called substantial rehab test in either a 24 or 60-month period. And you pick that period at the beginning of your rehab. You don't pick it in month 25 when you realize that you really needed 60 months. So we wanted to make sure that the IRS would give people a little bit more time. And we also worked with our friends on the Hill to introduce that in legislation. So we were asking the IRS, we were getting letters from the Hill to support that request and putting it in draft legislation, really trying to see which would move first. We were fortunate that the IRS moved quickly, so we were able to get that relief in the summer, and people now have until March to have an extension for projects that were underway at the onset of COVID. We also have been trying to figure out this financing gap issue for projects that have faced these COVID issues that I mentioned. So modeling our approach on what was successful in prior disaster relief legislation, particularly the GO zone, and then subsequently for Iowa flood disaster relief, we've asked for there to be a temporary bump up in the credit percentage from the 20% that we have now to a 30% credit. You'll recall, if you've been following our Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act legislation for several years, that we've been trying to get this as a permanent change for small projects. So we're essentially saying now we want that 30% to be available for all projects for at least 5 years, and then stay at that level for small projects, and the larger ones would go back to the pre-disaster related level. So we're trying to approach COVID as the national disaster that is occurring, even if it's not the physical disaster, and also look for opportunities where there have been physical disasters too, with widespread issues with flooding and hurricanes and wildfires in 2020, on top of all the pandemic issues, that we might be able to pursue that with future legislation as well. And then, as John mentioned, we're trying to ensure that when next a vehicle leaves the station that is going to include tax provisions, that we'll be able to get some of the permanent enhancements that we've been looking for the historic tax credit for several years. So I'll dig into that just to touch on the next slide. So the longest pass we've made down the field for a number of years now is the work that the House was able to do last summer in passing HR 2, the infrastructure bill, which includes a number of community development priorities, including, it's a mashup of our HTC GO bill and Congressman Evans' bill that would support historic school redevelopment, and a number of other priorities that members had. So as I mentioned, that included both the request we had from the IRS that we were subsequently able to resolve on a regulatory side, but also included both these temporary and permanent enhancements to the credit. So as we think about what comes next, I'll dig in just a second to what some of those permanent enhancements are that are on the next slide. Since tax reform, most historic tax credit projects have already been trying to retool to ensure that there's sufficient value in the credit. Pre-tax reform, our 20% credit was given to you at the time that you completed the rehab of your project. Now the credit is taken over a 5-year period. So that reduces the value of the credit in the hands of either the developer who's claiming it themselves or the investor who's investing in the project and receiving the credits. So we've been looking for several ways to ensure that the value of the credit can be restored and that the credit is simpler to use. So one of the provisions, in addition to just straight up bumping up the amount of the credit, is to fix some of the kind of glitchy tax things that reduce the value of the credit. One of those is the basis adjustment, which essentially means that on one hand you're getting a credit, but on the other hand you're losing another tax attribute that other real estate owners have in their properties. It's also a different approach than other tax credits have, like the low-income housing tax credit. So just eliminating the basis adjustment test would bring value to the credit, and it would also simplify the transaction structuring on a number of transactions. We also want to make the credit available for more historic properties, and so we do that in a couple of ways. One is to lower the substantial rehab test threshold. So right now you have to spend at least $1 more than your building's worth at the beginning of construction to be able to claim the credit. So we want to drop that by half, so you don't have to spend so much on your rehab to still be able to ensure that your historic building can stay in operation. We also want to make the credit more accessible to nonprofit sponsored projects. Today, the way the tax code is written, it's really a dream for tax lawyers like I used to be, and accountants who have to do backflips to make sure that projects are equally accessible to nonprofit sponsors as they are to for-profit sponsors. And so recognizing we want to be able to have our historic buildings used by people doing all sorts of work that benefit our communities, we want to simplify those rules and make them more accessible to other people. So on the next slide, I'll talk about what we want to do next. I won't put John on the spot and ask him when the House Ways and Means Committee is going to introduce our new bill, because we're still working with him and his colleagues, particularly Congressman LaHood, who's working with Congressman Blumenauer in the Ways and Means Committee to help us introduce our bill. And then we also expect Senators Cassidy and Cardin in the Senate Finance Committee to also work with us, as they did last year, on the introduction of the HTC Go bill. This year, we do want to use the HR2 provisions as our jumping off point. So we'll be able to refresh what we introduced pre-COVID in early 2020 to include some of the things I just mentioned, where we could also have the bump up to 30% for credit for projects that have been impacted by the pandemic. And we're also looking for opportunities to see if we could have essentially an automatic way that when a disaster is declared, that those projects would automatically get the bump up in the credit. So we don't have to go back every time there is and try to get new legislation just for that thing. We have a model that works. We should just implement it broadly. And then as things happen, folks can plug into that. So those will be some of our priorities coming up this year. I'll hand it off to Shaw to wrap us up and to talk about how you can get engaged with us in helping get our bill introduced, get our bipartisan sponsors across the House and the Senate to work with us in the new administration to make improvements and enhancements to the historic tax credit in this new administration and in the 117th Congress. Shaw, back to you.
Well, thank you, Merrill. Just waiting for this video to pop up. I think we're able now to turn to question and answer. Thank you for those of you who have submitted questions into the chat box. Some of those have already been answered, including a question about the temporary bump up, which I believe, Merrill, you covered sufficiently. Another question about the National Trust engagement on Oak Flats, which is something that we have been involved with for a long time and put on our 11 most list back in 2015. I believe that question was answered. On Alazan Courts and the need for funding. One of the ways that we are looking to support preservation funding for projects like this, for bricks and mortar funding, is through the emergency relief legislation that Congress is considering. As part of the Historic Preservation Fund, there are a number of grant programs that do support bricks and mortar projects, and we have urged Congress with the support of hundreds of colleagues and organizations from throughout the nation on increasing funding for those programs significantly in a COVID relief bill, which we hope will be considered in light of recent actions to do that. Another question came in about conservation easements. And certainly the National Trust looks at conservation easements as an important tool for permanently protecting historic places. And of course, the hangup has been that the IRS has become very skeptical of easements and audits almost all the easements moving through with on the conservation side, but also on the preservation side. The National Trust has supported legislation S-170 that would attempt to cap the amount of deductions that can be claimed from the value of the easements as a way forward. We think that's an important policy step that will hopefully help change the culture at IRS to allow more of these easements to move through the process more efficiently, so that can become a better used tool for preservation community. Looking at some other questions. A question for Maggie Ward. What he was hoping to clarify your comment noting the national heritage areas as benefiting. It might have been answered.
I actually, as soon as you were talking about it, I was typing a private response to it. But I'm happy. It is a little bit confusing because they are closely related, but they're still lands designated by Congress. So the national heritage areas, and we're still able to receive funding to address their backlogs under the GAOA.
Great, thank you, Maggie, for that clarification. There's a question about the effect or advocacy on revisions to National Register criteria to better address cultural considerations to help nominate more underrepresented sites. That has been a subject that the trust addressed at the last Pass Forward conference on questions of integrity. It's a question that we continue to engage with, and we do indeed hope to continue to address that. Perhaps that creates a bit of an opening for a question for you, John, on other ways to protect some of these sites and communities. And prior to 2017, that the 10% older building tax credit was something that could be used where the Secretary's standards did not apply. It had its own set of wall retention requirements, but there have been efforts and discussions since the 10% credit was eliminated in tax reform to bring that back and modify that, modernize that in a way to address some of the more current uses. And I'm thinking specifically about Representative Blumenauer's Rehab Act. And if you wanted to take a moment and just talk through the contours of that legislation that was introduced, bipartisan legislation that was introduced in the last Congress.
Yeah, thanks, John. Appreciate the there. I think, in addition to a lot of the work that the congressman's doing on the historic side, there's also the recognition of a huge amount of value and interest in building stock that's older, particularly within downtowns or near transit, and that could be at risk of demolition or underuse or going vacant without some sort of infusion of a tax incentive available. So the congressman in taking that knowledge and understanding has worked to introduce the Rehab Act, which was HR 6175 last Congress, which would reinstate the 10% credit, bump it up to 15%, and then include some additional criteria to make it a little bit more targeted of a credit. And those criteria would be that the old building would have to first go through the part 1 process to certify that it's not a historic building or located within a historic district. Second, it would have to be located within a half-mile ring of a public transportation center. This is largely focused, I think, on the hope of revitalizing dense transit-oriented development areas and contributing to those vibrant downtown or suburban places that have access to transit. And then would also include bonus credits that are available up to 25% of the QREs for expenses related to public infrastructure that's mandated by local government or the provision of affordable housing. And those two bonus credits at 25% would also be tacked on to the historic rehab credit, so as not to sort of put our thumb on the scale in one way or the other, but respect that a lot of times the requirement for public infrastructure improvements or the desire to fold in affordable housing could also include some cost considerations and wanting to be mindful of that to provide the incentive to do it. That's a bill we also, I think, intend to reintroduce this Congress and hope can make a play to go along with the historic rehab credit and try to have something that match up well together.
Thank you for that, John, and we appreciate your work to think about how the 10% credit might be brought back in a way that really addresses current needs. So I think we've gotten through most of the questions that have been raised. I will double check. There was a question about US EPA brownfield grants, which is something that we do keep an eye on. Merrill, I don't know if you might comment on integrating those types of grants into historic rehab projects, or if that's something that NTCIC has looked into.
Sure. I will say that the word grant often means you have to pay more money to your tax lawyers and accountants because you cannot finance qualified rehabilitation expenditures that are eligible for credits with grants without doing some just more sophisticated financing structures. Now, most historic properties include a lot of needs for capital that aren't actually tied to QREs. So we've seen brownfield related programs, especially at the state level, used very effectively in tandem with the HTC because it's usually financing site work that's not HTC eligible anyway. So this seems like a great opportunity for us to see more capital come into projects. One thing that we like about the HTC as a financing tool is it really is helping you focus on the building itself. And so it pairs pretty well with all other financing incentives if you can get them to layer properly. One additional thing I would say about combining incentives is as part of Congressman Blumenauer's approach to ensuring more affordable housing. That's one of the features of eliminating the basis adjustment in our HTC Go bill. It would make the HTC pair better with the low-income housing tax credit because today LIHTC does not have the same basis adjustment HTC does, but you have to use the HTC one if you're combining them together. So we're providing a drag on that, where you really want the HTC dollars to go to the historic rehab costs that make rehab expensive and ensure that whatever your use is going to be is still being financed by its incentives, whether it's LIHTC or EPA grant funds or others.
Great, thank you, Merrill. So I think we're on to, yes, the next slide. Thanks for the opportunity, panelists, to respond to a few questions. We did have a few announcements to make before the end of our session here. First, we do hope you'll save the date for our webinar on March 4th, where we'll look ahead at the preservation community's specific asks of Congress ahead of Preservation Advocacy Week. So please mark that one down. So to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. And with regard to Preservation Advocacy Week, we want to thank our partners at Preservation Action for all their work to host what will be a virtual Historic Preservation Advocacy Week from March 8th through March 11th. Please take note of the link on your screen to participate. That's preservationaction.org/advocacy week. Typically, we will have advocacy materials ready to go in advance of that, and we look forward to working with our partners at Preservation Action and NICSPO on that, and hope you'll all participate. It's easier to get to Washington virtually, so please join us there. Next slide, please. We also wanted to remind you to keep talking, keep the discussion going on our Forum Connect. This is our online community for people in the business of saving places. We have active conversations happening all week around topics from Section 106, women's history at historic sites. So if you have not joined Connect yet, I would encourage you to do so. It's a great place to keep up with conversations and start conversations. So please use that tool. Next slide, please. And just as important as talking, keep learning. Don't forget to take advantage of additional resources on Preservation Leadership Forum. I believe it's our next webinar is on February 18th, where we will host a webinar on Brown v. Board and Shell Brown Henderson and the legacy of the 1954 Supreme Court case, which will no doubt be very interesting session. Next slide, please. You got it already. Thank you. Well, this is our thank you and wrap up. So we want to thank our panelists, to John and Maggie and Sharee and Merrill for their expertise and their experience. We appreciate John and Maggie's work on the Hill. It's a slog, so we really do appreciate your taking a few minutes with us today. And for anybody that has questions following the webinar, please, as always, don't hesitate to contact us. Our email is forum@savingplaces.org, noted on the screen below. So with that, I think we come to the end of our hour. So thank you to everyone and have a great day.